The first sound was the crack of splintering pine, a noise as sharp and final as a gunshot. It tore through the sleepy afternoon hum of the sanctuary bank, a place where the only usual commotion was the weary sigh of a rancher denied a loan or the clink of coins being counted too slowly. Sarah Jane Hestwood flinched her hand, freezing over the small tarnished lock of her safe deposit box. For a moment, she thought the heat had finally broken something that the sun-bleached frame of the bank's front door had simply given up. Then the men came through. There were two of them, their faces lost behind grimy bandanas, their bodies lean and wiry, with the kind of coiled tension that belongs to predators. The one in the lead held a Colt Peacemaker, its long barrel sweeping across the room with an unnerving calm. The second man slammed the ruined door shut behind him, the heavy thud sealing them inside the stifling, sweat-scented air. He brandished a shotgun, its twin barrels like two dark, soulless eyes. Panic erupted. Mr. Abernathy, the town surveyor, yelped and dove behind a potted fern. The teller, a young man named Thomas, with a perpetually nervous disposition, threw his hands into the air so fast he nearly lost his balance. His face went white as bleached bone. "This is a robbery," the first man said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "Nobody needs to get hurt. We want the cash, and we want it quiet." Sarah Jane remained motionless in the small vault, hidden from their immediate line of sight. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She pressed herself against the cool metal wall, trying to make herself smaller to melt into the shadows. The bank held nothing for her. Her account was a testament to absence, a string of zeros that mirrored the hollowness in her chest since Daniel's death. She was only here for one reason: to touch the single tangible piece of him she had left. The first robber vaulted over the counter with surprising grace, shoving a canvas sack at the terrified teller. "Fill it. All of it." The second man, and the one with the shotgun, stood guard. His gaze swept the room, and Sarah Jane held her breath. He was methodical, his eyes missing nothing. She could smell the gunpowder on his clothes, the faint, acrid scent of a weapon recently fired. It was the smell of violence, a smell she knew too well from the war stories her father used to tell. The clatter of coins and the rustle of bills being stuffed into the sack was the only sound for a long, agonizing minute. Sarah Jane's mind raced. If she stayed quiet, they would take the money and leave. They wouldn't even know she was here. But her hand was still on the box, Daniel's box. Inside was his silver-engraved compass. It wasn't valuable, not in the way these men understood value. It was a simple brass compass, in a silver case, the lid bearing a crudely etched DH and a single lopsided star. It was the first gift she'd ever given him, bought with a month's savings from her job as a seamstress. He'd sworn he'd never been lost a day since. Then all the lead robber grunted at the teller. "Yes, sir, every last dollar," Thomas stammered. The robber tied the sack shut. For a blessed second, Sarah Jane thought it was over. But then he didn't move toward the door. Instead, his eyes fell on the open vault. "What about in there?" he asked. "Just boxes, sir," the teller pleaded. "Personal effects, jewelry deeds, nothing you'd want." The shotgun-wielding man moved toward the vault, and a cold dread sharper and more piercing than simple fear seized Sarah Jane. This wasn't right. Robbers took cash. They didn't waste time on the uncertain lottery of safe deposit boxes. "Let's have a look," the first robber said, joining his partner. He carried a small crowbar. They stepped into the vault. Sarah Jane was trapped. The space was barely large enough for two people, let alone three. The man with the shotgun saw her instantly. His eyes, just visible over the bandana, narrowed. He raised the weapon, the two black holes of the barrels staring directly at her heart. "Well, look what we have here," he rasped. "A little mouse hiding in the cheese." Sarah Jane raised her hand slowly, her gaze locked on his. She refused to show them her fear. "I have nothing," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Take what you want and go." The lead robber ignored her. His gaze swept over the numbered boxes, finally landing on hers. "Box 47, Daniel's box. His eyes flickered with something that looked unnervingly like recognition. He didn't try any other box. He went straight for hers. He wedged the crowbar into the seam and with a grunt of effort tore the small metal door from its hinges. The contents spilled onto the floor. A bundle of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon, a tarnished silver locket containing a lock of her hair, and the compass. The robber stooped and picked it up. He turned it over in his gloved hands, his thumb tracing the engraved initials. He didn't open it. He just looked at it, then tucked it carefully into his coat pocket. He kicked the letters aside his boot, grinding the locket into the wooden floor. The violation was more profound than any threat of physical harm. They hadn't just robbed a bank. They had desecrated a memory. They had stolen the last piece of her husband's soul. Why? The word escaped her lips, a raw, wounded whisper. It's worthless. The man with the compass looked at her, and for the first time, his cold gaze seemed to register her presence. Some things have more value than money, ma'am. He straightened up. Let's go. They backed out of the vault, their weapons still trained on the cowering occupants of the bank. At the door, the second man paused and looked back at Sarah Jane, a strange, almost pitying expression in his eyes. Then they were gone. The sound of their horses' hooves, a frantic tattoo, fading into the oppressive silence of the afternoon. For a long time, no one moved. The dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight pouring through the shattered door. Mr. Abernathy slowly emerged from behind the fern, his face ashen. Thomas the teller slid to the floor, his body trembling. Sarah Jane sank to her knees. She ignored the scattered letters and the crushed locket. Her hands moved over the spot where the compass had been feeling only the cold, empty space. It wasn't about the object. It was about the intent. They hadn't come for money. They had come for that compass. They had come for Daniel. And in that moment, kneeling in the dust and wreckage, Sarah Jane Hestwood knew her quiet life of grief and survival was over. A new, far more dangerous chapter had just begun. The sun in Sanctuary was a hammer beating the dust into a fine, choking powder that settled on every surface, a constant reminder that in this corner of Arizona, even the air was an adversary. The town clung to life like a stubborn weed in a crack in the rock, its buildings slumping under the relentless weight of the heat. Paint peeled from the facade of the general store in long blistered strips. The blacksmith, a man whose arms were as thick as wagon axles, moved with a weariness that went beyond physical labor. At dusk, the sun didn't set. It bled across the horizon, making the sand glow like dying embers and casting long skeletal shadows that seemed to claw at the edges of the town. Sarah Jane's homestead was a mile out, a lonely island in a sea of creosote and scrub. 2 years a widow, she was a ghost in her own life. Her husband Daniel, a good man with a dreamer's heart and a gambler's luck, had seen a cattle ranch where there was only rock and thirst. He'd left her with a mortgaged plot of land that refused to grow anything but sorrow, a sway-backed mule, and the pitying stares of the townsfolk. Her most pressing problem, however, had a name: Silas Kane. Kane owned the bank, the saloon, and most of the souls in Sanctuary. Daniel had borrowed heavily from him, and Kane took a particular venomous pleasure in reminding Sarah Jane of it. He was a man carved from granite and greed with pale, watchful eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. His cruelty wasn't always overt. It was in the small, calculated humiliations. She'd seen him just last week call out a sharecropper in the middle of the street for being $1 short on his supply bill, forcing the man to empty his pockets of his last few pennies, while Kane's ranch hands chuckled. He didn't just want your money. He wanted your dignity, too. The robbery had changed the town's atmosphere. Fear, usually a low, ambient hum beneath the surface of daily life, was now a sharp, discordant note. Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority seemed to extend only as far as Kane allowed, had been predictably useless. When Sarah Jane had gone to him, her voice tight with a cold, controlled fury to report the theft of the compass. He had barely looked up from his paperwork. 2 riders, you say, masked, he'd mumbled, not even bothering to pick up a pen. Sounds like the Miller gang. Drifters. They're 100 miles away by now, Mrs. Hestwood. The money's gone. You should be glad you weren't hurt. They didn't just take money, Sheriff, she had insisted. They broke into my safe deposit box. They took a compass that belonged to my husband. Brody had finally met her gaze, his own eyes clouded with a weary resignation that bordered on suspicion. A compass, ma'am. They just hit the bank for over $1,000. I doubt they were interested in your husband's trinkets. You were scared. You probably just misplaced it. His dismissal was so absolute, so deliberately obtuse, that it felt like a door slamming shut in her face. He didn't want to know. It was easier to blame it on anonymous drifters than to look for a truth that might be closer and far more dangerous. It was a blistering August afternoon, a few days after the robbery, that the trouble she'd been sensing finally took shape. The rumble of a wagon and the braying laughter of Kane's ranch hands, men like Pete Connolly and Gus Ryland, pulled her from the sliver of shade on her porch. Kane sat atop his black stallion, a monument of dark wool and self-satisfaction, a smirk playing on his lips. In the back of his buckboard was a crude travois, and on it a man. He was Apache. His long black hair was matted with dust and sweat. His skin was the color of rich earth, but his body was a wreck. He was bound with rawhide not because he could run, but to keep him from falling off. His eyes, dark and bottomless, were the only things on him that seemed truly alive. They burned with a silent, impotent fury. Afternoon, Widow Hestwood, Kane boomed his voice, dripping with a false courtesy that set Sarah Jane's teeth on edge. Heard you were complaining about being lonely out here. Thought you could use some company. His men snickered. Pete Connolly, a burly man with a tobacco-stained grin, spat a brown stream of juice that landed inches from her worn boots. Found him up in the Dragoons, Pete said. Looks like he took a bad fall. Useless to us, but we figured. Charity. The word charity was the punchline. They all laughed. Gus Ryland, leaner and meaner than his partner, untied the rawhide bonds and unceremoniously rolled the man off the wagon. He landed in the dirt with a muffled grunt of pain, unable to move anything below his neck. A shudder of revulsion and horror went through Sarah Jane. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice tight with a rage that momentarily eclipsed her fear. "A gift," Kane said, his smirk widening. He leaned down from his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss, heavy with unspoken meaning. "Your Daniel was always taking foolish risks, Mrs. Hestwood, poking his nose where it didn't belong. It seems to be a habit in your family." He gestured toward the paralyzed man. "Consider this a reminder of all the things that break in this territory. Men, dreams, promises." The message was clear and cold. Daniel had broken. Her dream had broken. And now this man, this living symbol of brokenness, was laid at her feet. It wasn't just a cruel joke. It was a warning. A deliberate, calculated act of psychological warfare. He was testing her, pushing her for reasons she was only beginning to suspect were tied to the stolen compass and the secrets Daniel had taken to his grave. Kane and his men turned their horses and rode off, their laughter echoing back, leaving Sarah Jane alone with the paralyzed man, the merciless sun, and the suffocating dust. She stood frozen, staring down at him. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not a plea for help, but a demand for death. He was a warrior, trapped in a cage of his own flesh, and her desolate yard was his final humiliation. Every instinct screamed at her to go inside, to bolt the door and pretend he wasn't there. He was Kane's problem, Kane's cruelty made manifest. Taking him in would be accepting the cruel terms of Kane's game, becoming the town's fool. Night fell, and the desert air grew cold. The coyotes began to sing their lonesome, hungry song. From her porch, she could still hear the man's ragged breathing. She thought of Daniel, of his slow decline after the accident, the hope dimming in his eyes until there was nothing left. Was she supposed to watch another man die on this cursed land? With a sigh that seemed to pull up the last of her strength from the soles of her feet, she lit a lantern. She fetched a bucket of water and a clean rag. She walked back out into the darkness, knelt in the dirt beside the Apache warrior, and gently began to wipe the grime from his face. His eyes, gleaming in the lantern light, never left hers. They were filled with hate. It was, she thought, a start. Hate was better than hopelessness. The first week was a silent war. The physical labor of caring for the man was immense. Sarah Jane dragged him onto a cot she'd moved to the porch, away from the worst of the sun. He was not small, and moving his dead weight left her muscles screaming and her back in a constant state of protest. Feeding him was a grim, humiliating affair for both of them. She'd mash beans and jerky into a thin gruel and spoon it into his mouth. He'd clench his jaw, resisting with the last bastion of control he possessed, until raw hunger won out. He refused to meet her eyes, staring instead at the splintered wooden beams of the porch roof, a prisoner studying the details of his cell. Her secret investigation into the stolen compass stalled before it even began. Sheriff Brody continued to be a brick wall of willful ignorance. She tried talking to others in town, but the robbery was old news, overshadowed by the fresh gossip of the widow's pet. That was what they were calling him. The name whispered in the general store and chuckled over in Kane's saloon drifted back to her. It was a brand marking them both as outcasts. Sarah Jane ignored them. Her focus narrowed to the simple, brutal rhythm of survival. She tended her meager garden, fed the chickens, and cared for the silent man on her porch. She spoke to him not out of kindness, but necessity. "I'm going to lift your head now. You need to drink this. Don't you dare bite down on this spoon." He never responded. His silence was a weapon, a wall of pride she could not breach. To him, she was just another white face, another link in the chain of his degradation. He was waiting to die. She was just the unfortunate jailer. One evening, a dust storm blew in the sky, turning a sickly shade of orange. The wind howled, whipping sand and grit against the small cabin. Sarah Jane wrestled with the canvas sheets she used to cover the porch, her hands raw and bleeding as she fought to tie them down. A powerful gust tore one of the ropes from her grasp, and the canvas whipped violently, knocking over her lantern. Oil spilled, and with a terrifying whoosh, a line of fire raced across the dry wooden planks of the porch, heading straight for the man's cot. Panic seized her. The man's eyes were wide with a terror that transcended his hatred. For the first time, he saw his own death not as a release, but as a horrifying, fiery end. Sarah Jane didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy horse blanket from Daniel's old trunk and threw herself onto the flames, beating them down with a desperate frenzy. The heat was searing the smoke, choking, but she smothered the fire inch by painful inch until only smoldering wood and the acrid smell of burnt wool remained. She collapsed onto the porch, coughing, her hands and arms burned. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind and their two sets of ragged breaths. She looked at him. His chest was heaving, his dark eyes fixed on her. The wall of hate had a crack in it. She saw not just fury, but something else, shock, confusion. Slowly, she got to her feet, wincing in pain. "Damn you." She rasped, not at him, but at the world. Damn this land. Damn Silas Kane. She limped to the water barrel, plunged her burned hands into the cool water with a hiss, and then returned with a dipper full for him. He drank this time without resistance. She sat on the edge of the porch, her back to him, and tended to her burns as best she could. The silence stretched, but it was different now. The animosity had been replaced by a tense, uncertain quiet. "Nash," he said. The voice was a dry, unused croak, barely a whisper against the wind. Sarah Jane froze. She turned to look at him. His gaze was direct, unwavering. "My name," he repeated the single word. A monumental effort is nashe. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of existence. He was not the widow's pet. He was not the Apache. He was Nach. He had a name, and in that moment, lying broken on a poor widow's porch, he had reclaimed a small piece of himself. For Sarah Jane, it changed everything. He was no longer a burden given to her by Cain, but a man named Nashe. The name was a key. It didn't unlock friendship, not yet, but it unlocked a new reality between them. As the weeks bled into a month, a fragile, unspoken partnership began to form. Sarah Jane started to notice the sharpness of his mind. His eyes missed nothing. He'd follow the path of a hawk in the sky, his gaze tracking it with an intensity that spoke of a hunter's soul. He watched the subtle shifts in the clouds, the behavior of the lizards scurrying in the dirt, the way the scant vegetation grew in patterns she had never perceived. One afternoon, as she was about to haul water from her nearly dry well, he made a series of clicking noises with his tongue, turning his head insistently toward a patch of wilted mesquite 50 yards from the cabin. Acting on a bizarre impulse born of desperation, she took her shovel and started digging. Hours later, soaked in sweat and covered in dirt, her shovel struck wet mud. She had found a shallow water seep enough to save her wilting garden. She stared from the muddy hole back to Nash. His body was broken, but his mind, his knowledge of the land, was perfectly intact. This discovery opened a new channel of communication. One blink for yes, two for no. A slight jerk of the head to the left or right. It was painstaking, but it worked. He became her eyes and ears, her connection to the land that had betrayed her. He taught her how to read the signs, where to set snares for rabbits, which plants were edible. Her small farm, once a monument to failure, began to show faint signs of life. Their growing success was a quiet rebellion that did not go unnoticed by Silas Cain. His regular, intimidating rides past her property became more frequent. His pale eyes would take in the small improvements, the irrigated garden, the reinforced chicken coop, and his face would darken. His joke had backfired. Instead of breaking her, he had given her a strategist. Meanwhile, the mystery of the compass gnawed at her. With her small successes providing a sliver of stability, she turned her attention back to her secret investigation. She found Daniel's old journal tucked away in the bottom of his trunk, a place she hadn't had the heart to look since his death. The entries were mostly mundane notes on fence lines and cattle prices. But in the last few weeks of his life, the entries became cryptic. He wrote of a partnership but never named the partner. He mentioned frequent trips into the Dragoon Mountains to a place he called the Serpent's Tooth. And then, a week before his fatal accident, a single chilling entry. He knows. He saw the compass. God help me. The compass. It was the key. She sat on the porch, the open journal in her lap, her mind reeling. She explained her discovery to Nutch, reading the words aloud. His eyes, which had been half closed in the afternoon heat, snapped open. When she mentioned the Dragoon Mountains, he became visibly agitated, making a low, guttural sound in his throat. She brought him the drawing stick. With painstaking effort gripping it in his teeth, he began to sketch in the dirt. He drew a crude map of the mountain range, a landmark she recognized. Then he drew a winding path, leading deep into the canyons, ending at a formation that looked like a jagged fang of rock. The Serpent's Tooth. He knew the place. They were a team now. Their two disparate missions, his for survival, hers for justice, converging into one. He was her guide to the land, and she was his link to the world. Together, they were piecing together a puzzle that Silas Cain had gone to great lengths, perhaps even murder, to keep hidden. The rising action of their shared life was building the quiet crescendo of two broken people, beginning to find a purpose in uncovering a buried truth. The air grew cooler as Sarah Jane guided her mule Solomon higher into the Dragoon foothills. The oppressive heat of the valley floor gave way to a thin, crisp breeze that whispered through the piñon pines. The map Nasha had drawn was seared into her memory, every twist and turn of the trail, a testament to his perfect recollection of the land. She had told no one where she was going. To the rest of Sanctuary, she was merely foraging for herbs, a plausible excuse for a day-long absence. But the small shovel and the heavy coil of rope tied to her saddle spoke of a different purpose. She found the serpent's tooth, just as Nacha had drawn it, a menacing spire of granite that clawed at the brilliant blue sky. The site of Daniel's accident was a narrow ledge just below it. The official story, the one Sheriff Brody had delivered with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground, was that Daniel had been prospecting, lost his footing, and fallen. A tragedy. Bad luck. Words that had never felt true. Tethering Solomon to a sturdy pine, Sarah Jane scrambled down the rocky incline to the ledge. It was a desolate, windswept place. Her heart pounded a frantic drumbeat of dread and anticipation. She had to know. For 2 years, the not knowing had been a poison slowly eating away at her. She began to search her eyes, scanning every rock, every crevice. She ran her hands over the coarse granite, searching for anything out of place. It was near the edge of the cliff, half hidden under a tangle of withered brush, that she found the first piece. It was the end of a rope, frayed and weathered, but anchored firmly to a thick root. It was the safety line Daniel would have used. He was a cautious man, not a fool. He never would have worked a ledge like this without being tied off. She followed the line of the brush to the cliff's edge, and there she found the other end. It hadn't frayed. It hadn't snapped. It had been cut. The slice was clean-angled, made by a sharp blade. A wave of nausea and icy cold washed over her. It wasn't an accident. He had been murdered. The word hung in the silent air, obscene and horrifying. Someone had stood on this very ledge, watched her husband dangle helplessly, and with a single deliberate motion had sent him plunging to his death. Her grief, a dull constant ache for 2 years, sharpened into a blade of pure incandescent rage. Her gaze fell to the ground again, now searching with a new terrible purpose. If they had cut the rope, they might have left something else behind. Her eyes caught a glint of silver, almost completely buried in the hard-packed dirt near the severed anchor rope. She dug at it with her fingers, her nails scraping against the rock. It was a button. A heavy, ornate, silver-backed button etched with the intricate design of a coiled rattlesnake. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen that button before. She had in fact sewn it on herself. It was from the custom-made waistcoat Silas Kane wore on special occasions, a gaudy display of his wealth and power. She had repaired a tear in it for him a month before Daniel's death, a small job for a few coins. She remembered the weight of it in her hand, the distinctive cold feel of the silver. The truth crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. Daniel's cryptic journal entries suddenly made horrifying sense. The partnership. It had been with Kane. He knows. He saw the compass. The compass was more than a keepsake. It was Daniel's tool for navigation, for mapping his discovery. Kane must have seen it, realized Daniel had a map to their shared secret, and decided he didn't want a partner anymore. They had found something here. Something valuable enough to kill for. A rich silver lode. That was why Kane wanted her land. It wasn't about the debt. It was about the silver that lay beneath it. His entire campaign of cruelty, the constant pressure, the public humiliations, it was all a twisted psychological game to drive her away, to break her spirit until she abandoned the land that held both the secret to his fortune and the evidence of his crime. Dumping Nash on her doorstep hadn't been a random act of cruelty. It had been a calculated move, a living warning of what happens to those who get in Silas Kane's way. He had intended Nash's broken body to mirror Daniel's, to serve as a constant, terrifying reminder that would finally force her to flee. But he had miscalculated. He had underestimated her. And he had given her the one man whose mind could help her fight back. Clutching the silver button in her fist until the edges bit into her palm, Sarah Jane stared out over the vast, indifferent landscape. Her fight was no longer about a piece of dirt or a lingering debt. It was for Daniel. It was for justice. And as she looked down the mountain toward the hazy smudge on the horizon that was sanctuary, she knew a storm was coming. And this time, she would be the one to unleash it. Armed with the terrible truth, Sarah Jane's world shifted. The grief that had shrouded her for 2 years burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. Every interaction with Silas Cain was now cast in a new sinister light. His smug smiles, his veiled threats, they were the machinations of a murderer trying to protect his stolen prize. Cain, for his part, could feel the change. He sensed her resolve hardening, her fear being replaced by something he couldn't quite name, but that felt dangerously like defiance. Her small successes with Notch's guidance were no longer minor annoyances. They were evidence of a mind at work, a mind that might be piecing together a truth he had gone to murderous lengths to bury. He needed to end it, and he needed to do it publicly in a way that would reassert his absolute dominance. He rode out to her property one morning, not with his usual swaggering entourage, but with Sheriff Brody in tow. Cain's tone was dangerously pleasant. "Mrs. Hestwood," he began, dismounting, "I've been admiring your industry. It seems this land isn't as worthless as your husband believed." The words were a poisoned dart, a direct reference to the secret they now both knew. Sarah Jane stood on her porch, a shotgun held loosely in her arms. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw no fear in them, only a cold, steady accusation. "The people of Sanctuary are planning the annual Founders' Day celebration." Cain continued, ignoring the silent challenge. "I'm sponsoring a new main event this year. A territory challenge. A test of skill and knowledge of the land." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I'm inviting you to be a competitor. A wager. If your champion wins, I will publicly tear up the deed to this land. It's yours free and clear." Sheriff Brody shifted his feet, his face a mask of discomfort. This was more than a contest. It was a public execution disguised as sport. "And if I lose," Sarah Jane asked, her voice level, "if you lose?" Cain said softly, his pale eyes glittering with malice, "You forfeit the land immediately. You walk away with nothing." He then delivered his masterstroke, his gaze flicking to the still figure on the cot. "And you give me the Apache." The threat was unmistakable. What for Sarah Jane demanded her blood running cold. "Let's just say I've found a new appreciation for his unique talents," Cain purred. "I have projects that could use a sharp mind. He'll be well cared for." It was a promise to take Nache to silence the strategist who was helping her to lock him away, where his brilliant mind could never threaten him again. It was an impossible choice, a perfect trap. Refuse, and she would lose the farm through foreclosure anyway. Accept, and she risked everything on a contest designed by her husband's murderer. She looked at Nash. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes burned with an intensity that startled her. They weren't afraid. They were challenging her. This was his fight too. He had been a warrior stripped of his ability to battle in the way he knew. But this contest, a battle of strategy, of knowledge, of will, was a war his mind could still wage. He gave one sharp, definitive blink. Yes. Sarah Jane turned back to Cain, her knuckles white on the shotgun. "You have your competitor, Mr. Cain. But I will be my own champion. I'll ride." Cain laughed, a genuine, booming laugh this time. The thought of the widow Hestwood competing against his best riders was the most amusing thing he'd heard all year. "Excellent," he declared. "Founders' Day. 2 weeks. I look forward to watching you try." He mounted his horse, a picture of smug satisfaction. He had her. He had laid a trap and the whole town would be there to watch it spring shut. The 2 weeks that followed were a blur of intense preparation. The dirt floor of Sarah Jane's cabin became a sprawling canvas. Nasha, gripping his stick, drew maps of the entire 10-mile course Cain had laid out. He knew every canyon, every dry wash, every game trail. His mind, freed from its physical prison, soared over the territory. He drew the main route Cain expected her to take, then marked the ambush points where Cain's men would be waiting. He drew the treacherous shortcuts, the dangerous paths that could save her minutes if she had the courage to take them. They worked ceaselessly, a silent commander, and his lone soldier preparing for a battle that was about much more than a piece of land. It was a race for justice. The day of the territory challenge dawned bright and painfully clear. A nervous energy thrummed through Sanctuary, which had turned out in its entirety to witness the spectacle. At the starting line, the contrast was stark. Cain's champion, Frank Patterson, a hardened rider with cold eyes, sat atop a powerful bay quarter horse. Sarah Jane was mounted on a wiry Mustang she'd bought with her meager savings, a tough, intelligent animal she'd named Ojo. Sheriff Brody raised his pistol. For a moment, the world held its breath. Sarah Jane closed her eyes, picturing Nasha's face, the fierce pride in his eyes. The crack of the pistol shattered the silence. Patterson's bay exploded from the line, churning up clouds of dust. He followed the compass bearing for the first stage with brutal precision, taking the obvious route over a long, sun-baked mesa. Sarah Jane held Ojo back, and then, following Notch's instructions, pulled sharply away from the main trail and into a narrow, winding game trail that was a claustrophobic tunnel of whipping branches. It was a terrifying, risky path, but she trusted Notch's memory over her own fear. The trail spat her out onto the open plain again, and her breath caught. Below her, a mile away, was the red flag marking the entrance to the Box Canyon. She had cut 2 miles off the course. She reached the flag first moments before a stunned and furious Patterson thundered up behind her. Inside the canyon, the second stage awaited roping and branding a wild steer. But Cain had laid another trap. A massive, aggressive longhorn patrolled the herd, making a clean roping impossible. As Patterson charged in, the longhorn slammed into his horse, scattering the herd into a panicked stampede. Sarah Jane ignored the chaos. Following Nasha's dirt map, she guided Ojo along the far wall of the canyon to a rock slide. There, just as he had predicted, was a lone calf separated from the herd. She roped it, easily branded it, and galloped out of the canyon, leaving a cursing Patterson in her dust. The final leg was a straight ride back to town. But Nacha had warned her the real danger lay ahead. As she cleared the canyon, a violent sandstorm, a freak of desert weather, began to roll in from the west. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind rose to a deafening shriek, whipping sand into a blinding, disorienting maze. She could barely see 10 feet in front of her. She pulled her bandana over her face, leaning low over Ojo's neck, trusting the horse's instincts. The storm was an unexpected ally, she realized. It would hide her from Cain's ambushers. She pressed on, navigating by instinct and the faint outline of the hills Nacha had burned into her memory. The final race marker, a tall wooden post, was supposed to be visible from a mile away. But in the swirling sand, she nearly missed it. It was located in a small, sheltered cove of rocks, the exact spot where Daniel had been murdered. The serpent's tooth loomed above a ghostly shape in the maelstrom. This was Cain's final cruel joke. He had made the site of his crime the finish line of his twisted game. As she reached for the flag tied to the post, her eyes fell on something lying at its base, uncovered by the scouring wind. It was the other half of the cut rope. Patterson, in his haste to set up the marker, must have overlooked it. It was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. In that split second, she faced a choice. Grab the flag and race to the finish line to save her home, or grab the evidence that would prove her husband's murder and secure justice. The wind howled, tearing at her, as if demanding an answer. Without hesitation, she snatched the frayed rope, stuffing it deep into her saddlebag. She grabbed the silver button from her pocket and clutched them both in one hand. Justice, she realized, was the only victory that mattered. Then she urged Oho out of the cove and into the storm, riding not just for the finish line, but for a reckoning. She emerged from the sandstorm like a vengeful ghost, a grime-streaked figure on a sweat-soaked horse. The crowd in Sanctuary, who had seen Patterson thunder past moments before, believing him the winner, fell into a stunned silence. They had seen her vanish into the storm and had given her up for lost. Now here she was, riding hard for the finish line. She crossed it, pulling Oho to a halt in a swirl of dust, her chest heaving, every muscle screaming. The silence was profound, the sound of a world shifting on its axis. Then a roar of applause and cheers erupted, a tidal wave of sound that shook the very foundations of the town. Silas Kane's face was a storm of black fury. Frank Patterson stared, his mouth agape in disbelief. But before Kane could react, before he could declare victory on some technicality, Sarah Jane dismounted. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She walked directly toward him, her steps steady and deliberate. The cheering died down as the crowd sensed this was not the end. Sarah Jane stopped a few feet from Kane's horse. She held up her hand. In her palm lay the silver snake-etched button and the cleanly cut piece of rope. "This button fell from your coat, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden quiet. "It fell on the ledge below the serpent's tooth, right next to the rope you used your knife on. My husband's rope." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The accusation was so bold, so direct, it was like a physical blow. Kane's face went from rage to ashen white. He looked from the evidence in her hand to the faces of the townspeople, faces that were now turning from awe to suspicion, from respect to contempt. "This is absurd." Kane blustered, his voice cracking. "The woman is delirious." But it was too late. The pieces were clicking into place for everyone. Kane's obsessive cruelty, Daniel's convenient accident, the fight over a supposedly worthless piece of land, it all now made a terrible, cohesive sense. Sheriff Brody, who had stood frozen now, walked forward, his spine straighter than anyone had seen it in years. He looked at the evidence in Sarah Jane's hand, and then up at the towering figure of Silas Kane. He saw the guilt in the man's eyes, the panic behind the bravado. The town was watching. His own shame, his years of cowardly deference rose up in him. Today, he would be a lawman. Silas Kane Brody said, his voice loud and firm. "You're under arrest for the murder of Daniel Hestwood." Kane's men, Pete and Gus, who had been slinking at the edge of the crowd, saw their power base crumble in an instant. They exchanged a panicked look and vanished into the nearest alley. Kane, trapped by 100 witnesses, and the undeniable truth, simply stared down at the sheriff, his empire of fear collapsing around him. The spell was broken. For Sarah Jane and for the entire town of Sanctuary, it was a moment of powerful cleansing catharsis. In the weeks following Kane's arrest, a quiet revolution took hold of Sanctuary. With the tyrant gone, the air itself felt lighter. The legal proceedings confirmed everything. The silver lode on Sarah Jane's land was real, and with the clear deed, its riches were now hers. But more than that, justice was hers. The townspeople, freed from the shadow of Kane's greed, approached her not with pity, but with a deep, abiding respect. They sought Natchez counsel openly, now his porch becoming an unofficial center of wisdom for the entire territory. The final scene took place on a quiet autumn afternoon at the town cemetery. The wind rustled the dry leaves, a gentle sighing sound. Sarah Jane stood before a simple wooden marker that read, "Daniel Hestwood, beloved husband." She knelt and placed 2 items on the small mound of earth. The first was the silver-engraved compass, which Sheriff Brody had recovered from the robbers' camp and returned to her. The second was the official clear deed to the land, its paper crisp and clean. The act was a final silent conversation with her husband, a promise fulfilled. His memory was honored, his murder avenged, his dream secured. A soft, whirring sound broke the silence. She looked up and smiled. Nash was with her. He was not on the porch. He was in a wheelchair, a remarkable contraption of wood leather and salvaged metal parts. It was sturdy, maneuverable, and built for the rugged terrain. It was a final surprise, a testament to their continued innovation and partnership. She had built it from his own brilliant designs, sketched painstakingly in the dirt. He wheeled himself to her side, his gaze resting on the grave marker, then turning to her. Their shared glance needed no words. It spoke of loss and hardship, of a bond forged in fire and silence. It conveyed the deep, unspoken truth of their journey. Two broken people who, by finding each other, had not only become whole, but had brought justice and balance to an unjust world. She looked out at the distant Dragoon Mountains, their peaks sharp against the endless blue sky. Their future, like the land before them, was vast and full of promise, built on a foundation of resilience, trust, and intelligence.